People who love to explore the western highways and byways while photographing the landscape and wildlife. And now here's your host, Kirby Flanagan.
How are you doing, Joe?
I'm doing well. I'm excited to be back and salute everybody that's watching.
Great. So you're the expert in this field, so I'm going to make you the presenter, and you've already shared your screen, so we'll just get rolling. It's your turn.
Okay, I'll do so. Well, let me preface this first off that I used to be a Canon shooter. I'm now an Olympus shooter, and the what I'm doing now is basically using Olympus equipment. But what I'm going to be covering today, in a big way, would be considerations and concerns that you would have no matter what system that you're using. The only difference in the two, in say the Olympus system versus Sony, Canon, Nikon, whatever, is Olympus has the capability of putting together your focus stacking or focus bracketing shot into one composite after the fact, and that therefore you do not need any software in order to do so. If you're not using one of those systems, then you must use a software. And I believe that both Lightroom and Photoshop will stack your images for you and make a composite. But there's also two great software programs. One is called Zerene. That's Zerene. Zerene, I think it's called focus stacking or focus bracketing. And then the other one is Helicon, Helicon, Helicon Focus. And that also is a great software program. Both of those are considered the cream of the crop as far as focus stacking goes. And in both of those, what you would do is import the images in and then hit a button that says like run or something, and it puts it together for you. So I used to use all that all the time when I was using Canon equipment, and either one of them works well. Folks that are really into this at times have both, and I do too, because sometimes, and it's amazing when you do some of these, that a particular image seems to work a little bit better with a say like with Helicon Focus over Zerene, and then you do another image and it's the reverse. So I think if you didn't compare apples to apples, you'd be happy with either Zerene or Helicon Focus. And I can't honestly remember what I paid for either one of them, but they're both great software. And I believe with Photoshop, it's I think you're using basically like the panorama version of it in order to stack. Easy to find out. I'm like I said, I'm kind of like out of that loop now because I've gotten lazy because the Olympus does that for me. But as I said, what we'll cover today, basically we cover either one. Kirby, anything to add on that right off the get-go?
No, only that I checked on Helicon Focus because that seems to be the standard, and it's an annual subscription at a fairly reasonable price, or you can get a lifetime subscription that's quite a bit more expensive. So I think their prices have come down because they used to be terribly expensive, I thought anyway. Zerene I'm not familiar with, so.
Yeah, I got them both years ago, and I just haven't bought. It's like everything else. Once you buy it, you don't go back to see like, oh darn it, it's cheaper now than when I paid for it, or
Yeah.
It's like, wow, I'm glad I bought it when I did. So, but let me start off what we're talking about here with this first image, which is I think you pronounce it Diogemetes robber fly, and robber flies are they're pretty distinctive looking. To me, they kind of look like a dragonfly fly cross, And those big legs that they have, they use to snatch insects in the air, like mosquitoes or flies or, you know, those species, then hangs by its hind legs, its last two pairs of its 6 legs. And then with that, you can see that pointed snout. Then it sucks the juices out of the insect prey. And once it has it basically sucked dry, it just drops it and goes on. There's a lot of different species of robber flies, but on occasion they can be skittish, you know. So to try to get close to one can be an issue. Now, believe it or not, this is barely cropped. I cropped it into a square, but I didn't enlarge it any further than what you see on the screen here. If I did, it was just by a small amount. But I used, again, not to plug Olympus, but this is what I used for it. I used a 300 millimeter Olympus lens that made it a 600 millimeter full frame equivalent with a 2x converter. And the lens itself focuses to just over 5.5 feet. So at 1200 millimeter at 5.5 feet, this is 0.9 magnification, almost life size. Now, if you've ever done any macro work, there's a couple things to consider, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail. But the closer you get to something, or I should say, the larger the image size, which could be because you're using a telephoto lens, it could be because you're physically moving closer. The larger the image size, the shallower the depth of field. So at 1200 millimeter, I might only have like the head of that insect really in focus and sharp, because the depth of field could be very, very, very shallow. This is out in the field. This is this is a wild shot. It's not done in studio. So I'm not going to try to get down to f/22 because the insect might move or there might be a slight breeze. So I would think I may have shot that, and I don't have the data with me right off the get-go, but let's say I shot it at like f8 or maybe even f11. The depth of field doesn't carry that far. But by focus bracketing or focus stacking, I could fire a series of shots where I could physically move the focusing point down the body of that insect from the first compound eye all the way down to its abdomen, and then put this together after the fact. So again, I did this with that Olympus system, and the amazing thing with that, and I do have to say this because it just blew me away. When I tried this for the first time last year, and I did this robber fly, and I'm using this 1200 millimeter, that shot, and it wasn't this one, it was the one I have on the cover of my ebook on focus stacking, was one of my absolute favorite photographs of the whole year. We're talking about shooting tigers and snow leopards and jaguars and giant otters and pumas in Chile, and yet that bug, that robber fly, was one of my all-time favorite shots of the year, because I never ever could have gotten a shot like that beforehand. And I did it with the in-camera processing, where when I took my first focus, which was about on the body of the insect itself, called the thorax. If you have my cursor, that's the thorax, there's the head, and there's the abdomen. Insects have 3 parts to them. Sorry, Kirby, for the biology here too, but I think that's can be helpful. So I focused right about here on the insect. And is my cursor visible on the screen there?
Yeah, but it's not over the fly.
Oh, it's not. Oh, now it is.
Yeah.
It was over my view of the GoToMeeting, but now it's over the fly, right?
Yeah, it's over the thorax.
Yeah, okay, so it's over the thorax. There's your head, and there's the abdomen. So true insects all have 6 legs. Spiders have 8 legs, so they're not insects. So I focused about here. And then when you're doing this with the Olympus system, and you're doing it automatically, it then focuses in front of the subject to take its first shot, and then fires a series of frames that you can then determine until it gets to the last one. So had I done 15, it may have started way out here where there was nothing, but the focus would have kept on coming till it hit the head, hit that part of the thorax, here, 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 until it was finished, and then put them together. And that's what I got. And when it was like, oh my God, I could not have gotten a shot like that before because I couldn't have got that close to that insect. You know, and I'm using 1200 millimeters, it would have flown away. And with all the depth of field. Now, if you were shooting something like this yourself and you weren't an Olympus shooter, and that's fine, what you would want to do is focus on the nearest part of your subject first. And as you're focusing, it would become very apparent. It might be this front leg here, or it might be this leg. And then you would physically move the focus very slowly, but take shots each time you did so, so that eventually your focus would rack all the way down the body of the insect. And that might then require, it might be 5 shots, it might be 10 shots or 15 shots. What I'll address a little bit later regarding this as well is that if you use a small aperture like f/16 or f/22, you of course get greater depth of field. However, your background can become discernibly distracting. So if I was at f/22, the grass blades or the other leaves that are, you know, comprising this habitat may have been visible as dark shadows or contrasts, as opposed to this nice bokeh kind of look, this soft focus look on the background. So it might be more prudent to shoot a series of shots with a closer focus differential between each image than it would be to shoot just like 3 and use f/22. But it depends upon your background. How you can determine that before you even take one is shoot one at f/22 and see what the background looks like. And if it looks fine, you know, that you can live with it, you're happy with it, then you could shoot your series of focus bracketing shots in that same fashion, and you'll be sure to carry your depth of field. Now, it's difficult to use in the field because it's it's a piece of equipment. But there's a company called Cognisys, that's COGNISYS, and they make some devices that are geared for photography that is absolutely first-class equipment. They have a thing called the Range IR. I'm tangenting here for a moment, but it's great for camera traps and for remotes where infrared sensor, when it's broken, pictures taken. And I've used that piece of equipment to photograph insects in flight. But why I mentioned this Cognisys company is they have a focusing rail that is automatic, that you can dial in how many shots you want the camera to take at what focus differential as you're doing so. Focus differential meaning, like, do we want it to be 1 inch between each shot, or 1 millimeter, or 0.5 millimeter? And for a subject, particularly in studio, I've never tried this out in the field with it because you have to plug it in. But in the studio for some things, I've used that, and it's just racked down the body of whatever I'm photographing. Now, the problem with anything like that is that if your insect is animated, you know, with the antennas moving about, or if the leg moves, or if it walks off the stage, you know, you're cooked. It ain't going to work because the insect has moved. But I haven't found it to be, for me, particularly effective for insects because they have moved. But I have used it for snakes and for small frogs and things that often will sit tight for you. And I was able to get that focus differential in that fashion. But anyway, the procedure for both of those is what I wanted to cover on that. And that's that basically you want to start at the front and work backwards. One point, again, that kind of like annoys the heck out of me with the Olympus is that if you have it set up that it will make the JPEG composite, and it's a big JPEG, it's a fine quality JPEG, you could publish anything with it. If you have the camera do it, it starts its focus in the middle and then jumps forward however many shots you have it programmed to shoot, and that can be as many as 15. So it would jump forward, let's say we use 15. It would jump forward 7 frames and shoot 6 shots till it got to the 7th here, and then it skips it and then goes back this way until it gets to the end. So you kind of have to guess where the midpoint is that it's going to focus front of and back from. If you're using it that it's not going to be an automatic stacking, if the camera doesn't stack it, then it starts at the very front, like I would suggest you do, and works backward. And it's a heck of a lot easier to say, hey, I want to have the tip of this proboscis sharp and work back from there than to go, I hope that the foreground, the head will be sharp if I start here. Maybe if I start here, this part will be out of focus. And maybe if I start here, the abdomen will be too far out of focus. So maybe in a future soft grade upgrade, especially if people are watching this podcast and complain to Olympus like I have, they'll change it because it's just a software thing to do on that. So anyway, that's the basic of what we're going to be talking about. Kirby, anything to add? Or
I should point out that the focus bracketing does essentially the same thing as the rail does. It will, you can set up the interval and you know, start focusing wherever you want, and then it'll do all the rest, including auto focusing and adjust.
Canon or Sony, and you start playing with it, you will fall in love with it because it certainly opens up a whole new world. Now, what I'm talking about today is using it with macro, because with macro, you know, depth of field is always a big issue, but you could do focus stacking on landscape shots as well. And if you had like flowers and a mountain in the background where you could kind of roll the focus along, I find like things like that with Photoshop would work very easily. You can make layers. I'll show an image of that in a little bit. But it does open up a huge amount of capability. Here's a point, too, that I haven't heard any photo instructor ever mention, but this is the gem of the day for you guys. So, Kirby, if you want to hit the soundtrack for the drum roll, we can do that, or if that's not queued up, we'll just go ahead with it as it stands. So here's the deal. Remember I said that as you get closer, whether that's, or get a bigger image size, whether that's because you physically move the camera closer or because you're using a longer lens to get greater magnification, as your image size increases, your depth of field decreases. Now, when people shoot macro, and believe me, being a film shooter to begin with, you're kind of like brainwashed. It's very difficult to get out of that habit. But if you're shooting macro, you by nature kind of want to get in close, you know, and fill the frame as best you can. But as you get closer and closer, your depth of field, regardless of the aperture you're using, gets shallower and shallower. And if you're closed down to like f/22 or some lenses f/32, the aperture size gets so tiny that you can have the light bending and actually soften the image because of diffraction greater than, or creating a softer image than you would if you were shooting it at like its sweet spot at the f/8 or maybe a f/11. So what I'm suggesting is this. If your camera has, depending on what your own parameter for what you want, but if, and this is where a high megapixel camera would really come in handy, if you back off and instead of shooting at 1:1 life size, shoot it at like 1:3, 1/3 life size, or even 1/4 life size, your depth of field at whatever aperture you're using is going to increase significantly. So there, at this image size, let's say this is 1:1, my depth of field truly may have only covered from the nose to this part of the thorax at best. I wouldn't doubt if it only would cover part of the compound eye. But when I back off and would go to like 1:3 or 1:4, my depth of field now might cover a good portion of this whole critter. And if I then crop, assuming I have the megapixels that will tolerate that, I now have an image that is sharper throughout than it would be if I used a smaller aperture and were closer. So that's a gem of a tip, whether you're doing this focus bracketing or stacking, or if you're just shooting a macro shot. And if you're new to photography and you're not kind of like an old school film shooter, you don't have the bad habit that you have to get whatever you see on your slide or your transparency is what you get. With digital, it's a whole different ballgame. Anything to add to that there, Kirby?
I think you're exactly right. Another reason to get a lens with a long focal length, like 180 millimeters for Nikon or 200 millimeters for Canon, I think. That way you don't have to get close enough that you're going to scare away whatever you're trying to focus on, or have to be on your hands and knees or whatever to get the image that you want. So when I went from I think it was a 50 millimeter macro lens to a 180 millimeter macro lens, it's certainly made my life a lot easier, and I haven't gone back to the smaller focal lengths ever.
Yeah, my recommendation on lens choice for something like that, if you only ever buy one lens, buy the biggest macro lens you can. Buy like a 180 or 200 macro or a 150. That's the basic range for most of these macro lenses. And that will give you an image size that will be maybe 1:1, but with a greater working distance. If you bought a 50 millimeter macro lens, your lens to subject distance might be about, your minimum focus distance might be about 9 inches, but from the front of the lens to the subject, it might be 1.5 inches or 2 inches. Now you try to get close to a wary jumping spider at 1 or 2 inches, or if you want to get a headshot of a diamondback rattlesnake, I'd rather be 4 feet away rather than 1 foot away. So the longer the lens, the better. 100 millimeter is kind of an okay compromise, particularly if you use electronic flash for your lighting, because with flash, the closer you are, the less, if you're using TTL, the less hard, you can use it in that fashion, the less hard the flash has to work in the sense that it doesn't have to dump all its energy. If you have a flash that's close and you're using TTL, it literally might just give a blink of light, but it's enough light to satisfy the aperture that you chose at the ISO that you were using. If you're 5 feet away, that blink of light might have to be a rather long flash duration. And the longer the flash duration, the more energy it takes out of the flash. And that means it takes longer for the flash to recycle that you could take your next shot. And if you were doing a focus stacking with flash, that could really be an issue, because your insect, if there was 15 seconds between one flash and the next, and that could happen if you're expending all its energy and the batteries aren't fresh, it's history. The insect's probably going to be gone. But if you're close and using 100 millimeter macro, you might be able to take a shot almost like as fast as you focus. The flash could keep up. So the longer the lens is typically my recommendation, but if you do a lot of flash work, you might want to consider a 100 millimeter macro. Shorter than that, and then you're getting into close working distances that probably work better for still lifes or inanimate objects. And by the way, because insects and spiders and other critters are all cold-blooded, some people cheat by putting their subject in a refrigerator to cool them down. And I absolutely despise that methodology. You know, it's just bordering on cruel. Don't do it. You know, work ethically. So, how about if we go on to the next image there, Kirby?
Sure.
Okay, let's see if I can do that. There we go. Now here was a fern fiddleheads in spring in our woods, and I did a focus stacking of this, and you can see that the foreground leaves here are sharp, and the leaves in the background are sharp as well. And I may have used 5 or 6 shots in this focus stacking series, and I really question whether or not I even had to do so. If I had closed down to f/22 and maybe backed off just a little bit, my depth of field may have carried far enough to do that also. But since I was playing with focus stacking, by golly, I was going to use focus stacking and use it that way. I think the lesson to be learned on something like that is sometimes you have a technique in your head, but it's more efficient to just do what you've always done, unless, as I was in this case, I was learning this whole procedure and kind of like practicing with things. But after the fact, I thought, man, I feel I could have just shot that, closed down, and maybe backed off and then cropped it to that position. But anyway, that's still life focus stacking. And then here's another one where I did focus stacking, and the limbs in the background and the foreground's all sharp. And this, I'm pretty darn sure that I could have just shot it as a straight shot. But if you're using a wide aperture, like let's say your lens isn't the best quality lens in the world, when you get down to f/16, 22, 32, the diffraction that occurs, and that's because the light comes. Let's see if I can do it. The light comes in, hits the focal point, and then crosses, and the image that appears on the sensor is upside down from what you originally saw. The tinier the aperture hole, the more that light has to bend in and come out. And if a lens isn't really the highest quality lens, you're going to have a little bit of blur that occurs from that. But that same lens at f/8 might be absolutely as crisp as virtually any lens you could buy on the market. And that's where focus stacking, like we're talking about, might really come in and be very handy. You good?
Yep.
All right. So this, again, was one of these like, oh, wow, I can't believe this shots. This is a ghost crab down on the New Jersey coastline. A friend and I were photographing black skimmers, and they were at a nesting colony there. And on occasion, these ghost crabs would pop up. And if you've ever seen ghost crabs and tried to approach them, in most areas, they're extremely skittish, and they immediately run back and drop into their burrow and disappear. These are the guys that are kind of like the horror stories of in nature films for sea turtles that are hatching, because as the sea turtles are going to the sea, the larger species of these things pop up out of the ground, grab a sea turtle that might be almost as big as the crab itself, and then carry that thing and take it down into the burrow where it's going to be slowly nibbled on until it's dead. They're the villain of the nature world there. Anyway, this was a straight 600 millimeter shot. Again, I was using the Olympus, and it was a 300 millimeter lens. And notice that the shells in the background are soft, and the foreground shell, particularly this one here, is soft. So we kind of have a selective focus image here. And just for yucks, to see if it would work, I put it on focus stacking, where it did it in camera. And you can see a significant difference in the depth of field. This foreground shell was still too close to be part of the image, but it really illustrated to me the power of this thing. And since then, I've used this same technique down in the Amazon, photographing with a flashlight, no less, tarantulas at night or beetles or whatever, and just let the camera do this focus stacking, and came away with depth of field using a flashlight at f4 that had the entire spider razor sharp. So the technique that this opens up is really, really a heck of a lot of fun. Now, here's an example where I was using the Olympus camera, but I decided to do it like I used to have to do it, and that's with Canon. And I focused on this grass blade that had a lot of water droplets on it. And my depth of field may have been, f11 or so. Tangent eyes here and see if my other computer had one. No. Let's say it was f11. Well, if you look carefully, you can see the upper part of that those dewdrops are completely out of focus. And I shot the next one, and the drops towards the top, and now they're really sharp, but the ones at the very bottom are very, very soft because the depth of field, the way the tilt of the grass blade was, the focus kind of rolled down or up the length of the grass blade. And then the final shot just had the very, very top of the blades sharp. So I took 4 shots here that pretty much covered the whole length of that grass blade, thick blade. Now, Lightroom and Photoshop could probably have composited that together, as would Zerene Stacking or Helicon Focus. But what I did here is I opened this image up in Photoshop. I was using Bridge, and I loaded it by load the images in Photoshop in layers. So it created a document, the image, with 4 layers, each one having one of these grass blades in it at different focus points. And these were the 4. And you can't see a heck of a lot of difference there in the screenshot. This is what was from Bridge, and you'd have the same thing if you were using Lightroom. And when I opened it then, you can see that I have 4 images stacked up. Again, I did Photoshop open in Photoshop layers, and then using a mask. This is the mask icon. If you can, Kirby, can you see it on the screen there?
Yes.
Okay, that's the mask icon. And then what I did using a paintbrush is I painted to hide part of this blade that was not sharp. And I did it up here too. So the only part visible in this image is this white area here. And then I would do the next with this one and this one. And you can see them. My GoToMeeting thing is covering my layers on my screen, but you can see that there's the top part of this is completely masked, and the bottom one you can just leave as it is because the other parts are going to stack on top. And the final image then was sharp throughout because I used the 4 sections of the sharp parts of the flower or the grass blade and put those into focus. And Zerene Stacker and Helicon Focus both will do that automatically. And both of them, I think, have the capability that if one of them is a little bit off for one reason or another, you can actually either eliminate it or correct it to some extent. But that's then exploring into that particular software. So the important point here, too, is my choice of aperture that I use, because you can see the blades in the background, the vegetation that's there. It's discernible, but it is not sharp. Mary and I, we call that the zone of apparent sharpness. And it's not even apparently sharp, but it has enough shape and contour to it that it gives it a sense of place. If it was completely diffused, it would be a grass blade against a blank background. And if it was even sharper, if I used a smaller aperture, then those blades and the leaves that are back there would have been really distracting from the subject itself. So don't by nature just think 2 or f/16, my lens is sharp enough that I don't have to worry about diffraction. Think about the background. And that applies not just for focus stacking, but any kind of macro work. And indeed, any kind of any photograph that you take, you want to make sure that the background complements, and if it doesn't, address it in some fashion or another. Any wisdom to impart there, Kirby?
No, I think you're exactly right. And that's one of the things that takes a while to learn to take into account. And that makes a big difference. It's pretty amazing how much the background can affect the quality of the photograph that you're taking.
Yeah, it's funny. Mary and I, a big part of our livelihood and our business has been leading photo tours and photo safaris. A lot in Africa. You know, Mary has 2 people in her vehicle. I have 2 in mine. We can help them, coach them, and whatever. And we always tell the folks before our first game drive to trust us. We know what you're after, and we'll get you the best shots. And I say this for this reason. Somebody might be driving along and they see let's say a tawny eagle in a tree, and it's like, you know, one of the birds of prey, and it's like, driver, stop, you know, this is great. Well, the background might be this bright sky. That's when you saw it against the sky. But if you would look and go, well, this road is going down the road another 35 feet, and there's going to be trees behind it that won't have a big bright sky, white sky against this bird. You'd have a bird against a darker background, and it would show up better. But people are so often kind of like, they see something and they're like, that's the shot, and you shoot. And instead, look at your background. Another point on that that's germane to virtually any kind of photography is images often evolve. You know, when you first, especially if you're using a tripod, when you first set it up, or if you're in a game drive and you see something and you shoot, well, that might not be the best composition or the best angle. But if you take your time and explore different possibilities, we used to do a thing in Saguaro National Monument, and showed a sequence of shots of I think it was cholla cactus, where when we started, it was like a little backlit, and it was like, oh, that attracted our attention. And then after we shot that and started moving about that same image, but now really paying attention to the light and the background, the image that we ended up with was really wonderful. The image that we started with was like, you know, truly a snapshot. So the image evolved. And as photographers, I would really recommend people having that patience and exploring different angles and think, all right, how can I make this better? Sometimes your first shot will be the best because it's, you know, you're lucky, but for a landscape, that's not necessarily so. With wildlife, it's always good to get that insurance shot first and then start messing around, because your subject may fly away or run away. All right. Now, I wanted to point this out. This is Saturn, or it's also a flying saucer, or in photography terms, this is the sensor's position in the camera. So when you look at the specs on a camera, and it talks about like the focusing distance, minimum focus, it is measuring from this point to your minimum focus. Now, I think with Canon, I recall, minimum focus on the 200 millimeter may have been about 8 inches at 18 inches at a minimum focus. But that lens that I was using was about a 7 or 8 inch long lens on a camera that had about 1.5 inches of space here. So minimum focus was a heck of a lot different than minimum working distance, which was only about 9 inches or so. So when you're looking at specs and you go, hey, a 100 millimeter lens is a great lens for, it'll be a minimum focus of 18 inches or so. I can get close. Well, or maybe 12 inches with that one. Well, yeah, minimum focus. But when you're actually trying to get something at 1:1, you might only be 5 inches away. And that might be too close. And I'll illustrate that with this. This is a 7 to 14 millimeter Olympus lens, and its minimum focus, I think it's 5 inches, but that's from here, minimum, to that sensor position, which is here. The actual working distance here from the minimum focus, you're only about an inch and a half from your subject. And that can work fine if you're photographing mushrooms or lichens or, something like that. But try to get a skittish jumping spider or a baby copperhead rattlesnake. You don't want to be this close to it. But 5 inches away, you might think, oh, that would have been fine. Would still have been too close for a rattlesnake, nonetheless. And here's with the 12 to 100, and I think the minimum focus on that, I think the minimum focus is rated at 7.5 inches. But again, it's about 1.5 inches from the front of the lens. That's an important consideration to keep in mind when we're talking about the choices of lenses for particular things, because you physically may not be able to get close enough. Now, your choice of lenses, though, can play a huge role in what your angle of view will be. And by angle of view, what I mean is again, if we go back to what I said earlier about as image size increases, depth of field decreases, you can get the exact same image size with virtually any lens you use. Whether it's an 8 millimeter lens or a 800 millimeter lens, the image size of your subject can be exactly the same, but the working distance will change. So at 8 millimeters, you may be as close as what I had here. And with 800 millimeters, you might be 12, 13, 14 feet away for that same image size. But at 800 millimeter, you would have just a tunnel of view, just a small little portion. Whereas if you're using, I think, can you see my hand there, Kirby, for my off the cuff? Okay. If that's real narrow with the 800, if I start using a bigger lens, that angle of view increases and increases and increases, that you get a big, wide angle of view. Now, when you're doing that, a wide view gives you a sense of place. It gives you a location. If you're using a long lens and you have it isolated, you have all your attention on your subject, but it doesn't necessarily tell you anything about where that critter might happen to live. I'll give you an example. Let's say we had let's say a butterfly on a flower. Well, if you shot it with the 800 millimeter, the background could be so restricted and blown out of focus that it could have been virtually anywhere. But if you used and got as close as you had with the 800, that you had the same image size on the butterfly, but used a 24 millimeter lens, you might see that indeed that was part of a huge garden, or it was in the middle of a wilderness. It would give it a sense of place. So your choice of lenses are really important for exactly what you want to convey. And that applies as much with focus stacking as it does, or focus bracketing, as it does with any other type of photography. So there's that 12 to 100. And then here is the shot with the 7 millimeter. And this is in my, like the meeting area in our classroom. And you see several of our prints on the back. And, if anyone had ever been to our studio, they go, "Oh, I remember that. That's where we all had coffee and beer and candy and BS and whatever." It has a sense of place there. And yet, if we go on to the next shot, which is the 12 to 100, you see there's only 2 images now present, but it's still, you've been there and you paid attention to our photographs, you'd maybe be able to recognize where we're at. Let's move on to the next one, though, which was, I think, the 60 millimeter macro. And now I'm back several inches, I think about maybe 12 inches away, and only one image, one picture is visible in the background. And yet the toy Nile crocodile is essentially the same size as it was, but my physical distance has changed. It's gone farther back, and my angle of view has increased enormously. Let's go to 40 to 150, the equivalent of 300 millimeter. And now that could be anywhere. If we go to the next one, which is, I think, the same lens with the 1.4 converter on it, we're at 420. That background now is very, very blurred. It's the same aperture as I used for the very first shot, where you could see that there was a puma and I forget what it was, a leopard or tiger in the background. Now you couldn't tell what was there. They were the same aperture, but you have a whole different set of optical principles going when you're using the longer lens. That's the lion in the background, but it could be anything. It could be a field or whatever. There's no sense of place here, but the depth of field is the same on the Cayman. It's just that the background has changed and the angle of view of that background has changed dramatically. And then this was with that last shot, by the way, I think it was with my 300 with a 2x converter on it. So it was 1200 millimeter. I was, 13 feet away, and what we see of that Nile crocodile there is about 5 inches of toy. And if I went to minimum focus with that lens, which is a little over 5.5 feet, that's what I got. Now you notice that the snout of that caiman or that crocodile is blurred because the depth of field when I was that close was so much more narrow. As image size increases, depth of field decreases, that it didn't cover the entire snout, whereas in the last shot, that snout was sharp. This would be a perfect candidate then to do a focus stacking and putting it together after the fact. Imagine if this was a spider. If this was a head and that was its back end of its abdomen, that head would be completely blurred. But in focus stacking, you could shoot a series of images and then composite them together. Now, what I've done here, and again, with the Olympus, it puts this together and it would make the shot, but the same principles apply whether we're using Nikon, Canon, Sony, etc., and you do it yourself. I have an aperture of f4 and I have a focus differential of 10. And what that means is there's in the span of this image, there are the picture is taken with 10 shots with as wide a differential to cover the area. And if you look, you can see right here that that's not very sharp. And here it's not very sharp. And that 11 isn't very sharp. Because when it put this together, and it did so automatically, but you would do the same thing if you were using software to do so. There's nothing you can do there because the gaps in between those spots, because of your choice of aperture, and the other, your focus differential, how much of a space you have between each of those focuses creates soft areas. Here, I have a f4, a wide focus differential, but I have 15 shots that I did. So in that same span, you can see that it's a lot clearer, but even here, it's not quite as sharp as it could be. And can you imagine if you had like a beautiful let's say a snake, a wonderful texture going down through its scales. And at one point in its body, it's blurred. Yeah, it's not as perfect as it otherwise could be. Now I'm at f22. And if you look here, you can see that for those 10, in fact, I only used 3 shots. So one of them may have been like right here in the focus. The other one was right here where I focused the camera. Remember, with the Olympus, it focuses from the furthest to the farthest after it takes the first shot. And then the other one is way back here. But the depth of field at f22 covered everything. That's great. With only 3 shots. However, it can create problems for your background. And that's the important thing to consider there. And I'll be illustrating that in just a moment. Kirby, anything to add to that discussion there?
Don't think so. I think you covered it well.
Okay, we will go on then. So here's a focus differential of 10 at f22, and you can see the depth of field is covering pretty much the whole thing, and that's with only 3 shots. So you can see that if you look carefully, you can see from about the number 18, you should be able to see that on your screen.
Yes.
But it's not sharp. It is apparently sharp. It's what Mary and I call the zone of apparent sharpness. The actual sharpness really goes from about here to maybe here. So what, 13 to 8. But again, that could be partly a factor of the fact that I only had 3 shots in that focus differential. And I used a Cognisys focus automatic racking system, or I think Nikon now has a kind of a similar system built in. I could have taken 10 shots and it would have just fired down a series of them to cover that whole area. And there'd be no question then, or, depending on where you started, you might have this entire ruler completely sharp. That's fine for your subject, but it's not addressing the background. And that's what we've got to be careful about. So here's a focus differential of 10 again at f8 with 5 shots. And to my eyes, it looks pretty darn sharp, pretty much until we get past the Komodo dragon here. But around, what is that? Around maybe 14. And we're set up at, I think my focusing point was around 10 inches. So when it got to around 13 inches, it started getting soft. 10 inches here at 7, you can see it's a little bit of a gap here of sharpness. Again, because of the focus differential between each of those shots. Now, here's a focus differential of 10. I took 15 shots, and my toy Komodo dragon is completely sharp. But this is one of the photographs that's in our meeting area, and you can see there's this is a photograph in the background. I didn't do this toy in Torresdale Piney with Puma in the background, but you can see the Puma there is discernible. And if this was a distracting background that all I wanted to do was show the Komodo dragon, f22 really wrecked that shot. If instead I want to illustrate that Komodo dragon toy was shot in my meeting area, well, this gives a good clue that that's where it was, because that background is somewhat discernible. COVID's going to get you every time. So here's the thing again. You can see the mountains are reasonably clear. And I wanted to point out that you look carefully at this. I put a lens cap behind it to show in the in-camera version with the Olympus. Sometimes it goofs up a little bit, and there's kind of a ghost image of Olympus here in the background, and that's certainly detracting from a perfect shot. That's what I was after there. But the other important point, though, is again, the mountain, the Puma are all clearly visible. And if I only wanted to have my attention on the Komodo dragon, it would be more prudent to have a more narrow focus differential, which you would do yourself by how much you would focus, and then use more frames at a wider aperture, shallow depth field, which is indeed what I did here. You can see that Olympus is just slightly blurred, but not much. I have 15 shots with a focus differential of 10, so it still was a rather broad amount. But my aperture is f4, and those mountains and that puma, they're gone. You know, it's now a very, very soft background. It does not compete with the subject. Trying to show a sense of place, I lost it on this shot. It doesn't do it because the background is blurred. So is that pretty clear there, what I've been saying there, Kirby, for the importance of your aperture choice?
Yes, I think so. I'm assuming that the 10 on there is millimeters and not inches, huh?
The 10? No, that was actually with the Olympus camera. You have a focus differential that goes from 1 to 10. And
okay.
it's not necessarily millimeters. It would be a relative scale. If you were using this on with a landscape, that 10 might represent 2 or 3 feet gaps between each shot. It might only represent a quarter inch in a macro shot, you know. So it's a floating number kind of in that regard, but it gives you a clue as to how big of a gap. And again, it would be the same thing if you were doing this manually and putting it together in Photoshop or with Zerene Stacker or Helicon Focus. The more images you have, the tighter that focus can be. To give you an example, with the Olympus, if you did it manually, that you would put it together with Zerene Stacker or something, you can only do as many as 15 shots that it puts it together automatically. If you're doing it manually, I think it's 999. Maybe it's only 99. But can you imagine? Then you would be talking about like something like this, a focus that would be like a millimeter or so. But again, if you were shooting, say, a whole compound eye of a dragonfly and head of a dragonfly, you would want that tiny little increment going on. So in doing it, you have to kind of experiment with the subjects you have, and then also how tolerant your subjects will be. Case in point with the dragonfly, if you try to do this live, if you've ever been close to a dragonfly, they have these 2 compound eyes, but they're really not fixed. They can kind of like move their eyes a little bit. And if it's moving, you're not going to composite it. It'll be a blur. So I'm in South Africa, and we were just walking around after a game drive, looking at termites and whatever. And our guide pointed out this tiny little mushroom, and this was my second shot. It's a focus composite where basically the foreground mushroom is reasonably sharp and here it's sharp. But I say this was my second shot because the first shot I didn't use my head. I did not do what I have been telling you guys to do, and that is be concerned about background. And I stupidly had set the camera lens at like f16 or f22. So it composited all together. Again, this was automatic, but I would have had the same results had I done it with a different system and did it manually. And this is what I got. And look at the difference between these two. Soft, non-distracting background as opposed to a background that is now rather competing with the subject. Neither of these shots are going to be calendar pictures, but they were a good example of how this thing is working and the importance of your selection of your aperture in the exact same image. So there was that final result there, much more pleasant than the first two. And that would apply as much to the fungi here as it would to virtually anything else that you're shooting. Now, when you're doing a composite, it's quite possible that what you start with your first frame, when it's composited together, it may end up being cropped to some extent because of the parameters of the software itself. In Olympus, when you do a focus bracketing or focus stacking, there's actually a black line that inscribes the sensor that area inside the black line is the area that is going to be in the finished composite. I can't tell you how often I've ignored that line, framed it what I thought was correctly, and ended up with my image partly being cropped. Well, what do you know? Here's a perfect example. This is a Southern Copperhead, and when I framed this, I had the whole snake in, but if I had looked at that black rectangle, I would have seen that I was indeed cutting off part of that snake. And if I go to the next shot, you see that the entire snake is now in my focus. With the focus stacking, went from the very front all the way to the back. And I may have been using like f5.6 or f8 for the depth of field, but in compositing it together, you have a snake that is completely in focus. I shot a water snake recently like that, and I was just blown away by it. Was coiled in a fashion that was kind of like angled away from me. And I actually shot it without the focus stacking and then with, and try as I might at f22, focusing at different parts on the snake, at the image size I had, I could never get the entire snake sharp. One part was, another part wasn't. If I used the focus stacking, I had the entire snake crisp. Really, this chipmunk is in my garden, and it's one of a series of shots that I shot with, again, I shot this with Olympus by accident. I had been shooting something earlier where I was using that focus stacking, focus bracketing technique, and I didn't reset my camera. And I was out to photograph birds in our garden, and this chipmunk was there, and I thought, oh, that's a nice shot, I'll take it. And as I fired, it was like, to my horror, I was like, oh my heavens, it's shooting a whole series of frames. So in this one, you can see the eyes and the snout, or well, the snout isn't really, really sharp because the first shot of it that was here. But notice the background. Background's blurred. Well, look at it, ended up with the background sharp, and you can see that the chippy is completely soft as this went from front to back. And then it composited the shots. And by the way, with this, it just doesn't end up with one JPEG. You have all the other images too. So if you wanted to stack them together yourself, you can go ahead and do so. But when it's finished, if you hit the little playback button, I got this. And I was like, oh man, I love that. You know, the chipmunk is sharp all the way through. The rock is perfectly sharp. And it was shot at like f5.6 or something. So I was, surprising in that regard for that I got the shot. But since then, I've shot a lot of the chipmunks and things like that because it really works, and it gives me wonderful depth of field and a sense of habitat. And I think that's the last of the images on that. And,
so I think that's a wrap for this episode. So bye for now, and we'll be back on